In 1838, a prophet in Missouri delivered a revelation. God, he said, had exactly one financial law for his people, and it was simple. Give 1/10 of everything you earn every single year forever. Not saved, not grown, given. By 1997, that tenth had become something else entirely. A single fund run out of an unmarked office building in Salt Lake City, quietly buying stock in Apple, in Amazon, in companies that had nothing to do with any church at all. Tens of billions of dollars, compounding year after year, that nobody outside a locked room could put an exact number on purpose. And the way they kept regulators from finding that number for 22 straight years wasn't a firewall or an encrypted server. It was 13 paper companies, 13 names on filing forms, built one at a time, redesigned twice after two separate close calls, so that no single document would ever show the real size of a fund built from sacred donations. By the end of this film, you'll see that exact device, the one that hid a religious fund from federal regulators for over 2 decades, sitting quietly inside institutions you already trust with your own money. This isn't really a story about one church. It's a blueprint for how any institution, religious, corporate, or somewhere in between, learns to hold money the public was never meant to measure. Here's the mega question. How does an organization built on a vow to give become one of the most secretive investment funds in American history and stay completely legal the entire time it's doing it? I'm not here to tell you what to think about tithing or about faith. What I can tell you is what's in the documents. A Securities and Exchange Commission settlement from February 2023. A whistleblower complaint filed with the IRS in 2019. A 90-page memorandum handed to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, and 22 years of filings that were never supposed to add up once you laid them side by side. Where the church disputes a detail, I'll tell you. So, 3 questions to carry through this whole film. 1. How do you legally hide the size of a multi-billion-dollar portfolio from the public for 2 decades? 2. Who noticed, and what did it cost him? 3. The one nobody in Salt Lake City wants asked out loud. Is a $5 million fine a punishment or a receipt? On paper, this starts as a routine securities filing. But underneath, the paperwork itself was the crime, and it took federal investigators most of 2 years just to prove it. To understand what happened in 1997, you have to go back to a much smaller room, 159 years earlier. In July 1838, the Latter-day Saint movement was roughly 3,000 people deep and, by any honest measure, bankrupt. Joseph Smith, its founder, had just watched a bank he'd helped launch in Kirtland, Ohio, collapse entirely within a year of opening, its notes worthless, its investors furious. The failure would cost Smith some of his closest early allies, several of whom broke with him over it. The church owed debts it had no realistic way to pay, and into that exact moment of financial ruin, Smith announced a revelation, recorded as Doctrine and Covenants, section 119, that didn't ask members for a one-time bailout. It demanded something permanent instead. Those who have thus been tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, and this shall be a standing law unto them forever. Forever. Not a fundraising drive. A commandment, sitting in the same book of Scripture as the ones about murder and adultery, and it borrowed its logic from somewhere much older. The prophet Malachi, writing roughly 25 centuries ago, in the 5th century before Christ, gave that money one specific home. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. A storehouse, not a vault. Grain goes in, and grain comes back out, to widows, to orphans, to next season's seed. A storehouse that only fills and never empties isn't a storehouse anymore. It's something else. For roughly 100 years, that's more or less how it worked, more or less. Tithing paid for temples, for missionaries, for a fledgling university in Provo. Money in, money spent, the ledger essentially flat year over year, and, in the early days, occasionally reported, in broad terms, right from the pulpit at General Conference. But by 1962, aggressive worldwide chapel construction had driven the church into a $32 million deficit. In 1963, church president David O. McKay pulled a Canadian businessman named N. Eldon Tanner directly into the first presidency to fix it. Tanner did fix it. Strict budgets, mandatory reserves, spend less than you take in. But at the very same time, he also did something else. The church stopped giving members detailed financial reports altogether. The public reporting that had been an inconsistent but real habit for over a century simply stopped and never resumed. That single decision, discipline paired with silence, is the exact seed of everything that follows. By the early 1990s, 3 decades of Tanner's discipline, invested and compounding without a single public report to interrupt it, had produced something Joseph Smith in 1838 could never have imagined. The church had gotten rich. Not the bills are covered rich. Rich in the way a small number of American institutions are rich, with a stock portfolio compounding faster than anyone could figure out how to spend it. One detail makes this personal, not abstract. To this day, an individual Latter-day Saint has to declare themselves a full tithe payer to a local bishop, in person, once a year, to keep something called a temple recommend, the card that lets them enter the church's most sacred buildings. Miss that interview, or answer it honestly as a partial payer, and the door closes. Every ordinary member's 10% is checked, face-to-face, annually, by name. But for 22 years, nobody checked the institution's number at all. Gordon B. Hinckley became president of the church in 1995. He inherited a problem no prophet before him had ever faced: a storehouse that was overflowing, and no clean, public way to explain to millions of tithe-paying members exactly how much was in it or where it was going. So in 1997, under his administration, the church's senior leadership, the First Presidency, its highest governing body, did something quiet and at the time almost unnoticed. They spun the investment operation into its own separate legal entity. They pulled the name from local geography, a hill overlooking Salt Lake City where, according to church history, Brigham Young once said an angel showed him exactly where to build the temple. They called it Ensign Peak Advisors. And the very first thing Ensign Peak Advisors did was hire a man who had never worked for a church in his life. Roger Clark had a doctorate from Stanford, an MBA from Brigham Young University, and a career built entirely on modern portfolio theory, the same discipline that runs university endowments and pension funds. Outside the church, he was already respected enough in institutional finance to later chair a well-regarded quantitative investment firm. He wasn't a bishop, he wasn't a mission president, but he was exactly what a fund this size needed: a quant. And in July 1997, the church handed him the largest pool of religious capital in the country, with exactly one mandate: don't lose it, and don't stop growing it. For the next 23 years, that is precisely what he did. Here's the part that should stop you. Unlike almost every American endowment of comparable size, Harvard's, Yale's, the Gates Foundations, Ensign Peak had no legal obligation to spend any minimum percentage of its assets each year. A private charitable foundation in the United States has to distribute roughly 5% of its holdings annually, or risk losing its tax status entirely. A university endowment faces alumni boards, public pressure, occasionally a state legislature asking pointed questions. But Ensign Peak, structured as an integral arm of a church rather than a standalone foundation, faced none of that. It could compound, completely untouched, indefinitely. And it did exactly that. Clark ran the fund the way an institutional manager runs an endowment that never has to justify a withdrawal. Broad public equity positions, blue-chip American companies, patient, disciplined, almost monastic in its refusal to spend. Apple, Amazon, blue-chip names across tech and industrials. A portfolio that began the 1997 spin-off in the single-digit billions kept growing, year after year, decade after decade, without a single quarter of public accounting for where it stood. By 2018, the disclosed public filings alone, just the fraction the SEC could later verify on paper, showed roughly $32 billion in equities. Not the total fund, just what could be proven. That disclosed slice alone was already larger than the endowment of nearly every university in the country, trailing only a handful of names like Harvard or Yale. But that $32 billion was never the true number. It was only the part regulators could later prove, the tip of a portfolio deliberately built so that no single filing would ever show what sat beneath it. Clark retired in 2020 after 23 years at the helm, widely respected inside the small world of institutional money management for the discipline that made this story possible. He never once, publicly, had to explain a withdrawal. Compare that to any secular endowment his size. Harvard's investment chief testifies before oversight boards, publishes annual reports, faces alumni scrutiny every single year. Clark answered in practice to a handful of church leaders in a private boardroom and to no one else. But that privacy wasn't automatic. It had to be built and defended actively for over 2 decades. Because for most of Roger Clark's 23 years running Ensign Peak, regulators weren't supposed to be able to see the whole picture at all. There was a specific legal reason the fund could grow that large without anyone outside a locked room in Salt Lake City knowing the real total. And it comes down to one federal form, $1 threshold, and 13 names that were never supposed to be connected to each other. Any institutional investment manager in the United States controlling more than $100 million in public equities is legally required to file something called a Form 13F every quarter, publicly. It lists exactly what you own, which stocks, how many shares, what they're worth. Congress created that requirement in 1975, in the wake of growing alarm over how much of the American stock market a small number of institutions had come to control. The idea was simple. If you're big enough to move markets, the public gets to see you do it. For a normal hedge fund, that's mildly inconvenient. But for a church that had spent a century training its members to give without asking questions, a public quarterly filing revealing tens of billions of dollars in stock holdings was closer to a crisis. Proof, in black and white, that the Storehouse Malachi described had become something Congress itself was built to watch. And the church had a specific, bitter reason to fear federal eyes on its money in the first place. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, targeting the church's practice of polygamy, and it didn't stop at outlawing the marriages. It dissolved the church's legal corporation outright and authorized the federal government to seize any church property worth more than $50,000. By the time courts finished sorting it out, the United States government had confiscated more than $1 million in church assets, an enormous sum in 1887 dollars, and in 1890, the Supreme Court upheld the whole thing. The lesson church leadership carried forward for the next century wasn't subtle. When the federal government can see what you own, the federal government can take it. That lesson was still very much alive in the room 110 years later, when someone had to decide what to do about a $100 million disclosure threshold. So, according to the SEC's own findings, Ensign Peak solved that problem in the most literal way possible. It stopped filing as itself. In 2001, it created its first alternative, a single shell company registered with an address in Glendale, California, where Ensign Peak conducted no business whatsoever. One shell, one filing, no visible connection to Salt Lake City. That should have quietly solved the problem for good. It didn't. In 2005, the arrangement nearly fell apart. Church leaders discovered that the person listed as the signer on the shell company's paperwork was publicly identifiable in an online directory as an employee of the LDS Church. One search engine query away from unraveling the entire structure. So senior leadership approved a second shell company, this one based out of Wilmington, Delaware, a state that, at last count, was home to more registered corporate entities than actual residents, precisely because its law doesn't require an LLC to disclose who really owns it. It wasn't a loophole Ensign Peak invented. It was infrastructure the whole American economy had already built, sitting there, waiting to be used by anyone who needed a name that wasn't theirs. For 6 years, 2 shells carried the weight. But in 2011, the fund had grown large enough that church leaders became explicitly worried, in the SEC's own language, that its true size would draw unwanted attention. Their solution wasn't to file honestly. It was to scale the concealment. 5 additional shell companies, approved at the senior level, bringing the total network to what investigators would eventually count as 13. This is the mechanism itself, the actual word that got around the commandment of disclosure. Instead of Ensign Peak filing 113F showing its real consolidated multi-billion-dollar position, the portfolio was split. Piece by piece, each shell filed its own smaller 13F under its own forgettable name, with no single document ever showing the true total. Anyone trying to do that math honestly would have needed to identify all 13 shells, prove they traced back to one manager, and add up filings that were never designed to be added. The SEC's later order was almost clinical about the intent behind it. The structure existed, the agency found, specifically to obscure the church's control of Ensign Peak's investments and to avoid disclosing the church's portfolio to the public. Not a clerical accident, repeated by coincidence across 13 separate filings and 2 decades. A structure. Built, expanded twice under pressure, and maintained on purpose by senior leadership who signed off on every version of it. And the reason given internally, according to later reporting in the SEC's own findings, was almost sympathetic on its face. Leadership worried that if members ever saw the true size of the fund, in black and white, on a public filing, they might tithe less, or start asking uncomfortable questions about why a storehouse that size wasn't visibly feeding anyone. Which raises the exact question those 13 shells were built to prevent anyone from asking out loud. If the fund had grown that large, what, if anything, was actually being taken out of it? For 22 years, that question went unasked in public, because almost no one had the access, the training, and the documents to ask it credibly. But one man inside Ensign Peak had all 3. And what he found is the entire reason any of us know this story at all. David Nielsen came to Ensign Peak as a Wall Street money manager who'd chosen, deliberately, to bring his skills home to Utah and put them to work for his own faith. He wasn't an outsider looking for a way in. He was, by every account, a believer who landed the job most members of his church could only imagine, a seat inside the storehouse itself as a senior portfolio manager. From that seat, over years, he watched the number grow, not toward some announced target, not toward a defined charitable mission, just grow. But nobody at Ensign Peak was doing anything against the rules by growing it. That was, on paper, the entire job. By 2019, Nielsen had reached a conclusion that put him directly at odds with the institution paying his salary. Under U.S. tax law, an organization holding tax-exempt charitable status is supposed to actually use its money for religious, educational, or charitable purposes. Not indefinitely, not eventually. Nielsen came to believe Ensign Peak had failed that test for 22 straight years, accumulating a fortune he estimated, in his own complaint, at somewhere between $99 billion and $101 billion, while distributing only a small fraction of it. He resigned in 2019, and on November 21st of that year, David Nielsen and his brother Lars Nielsen filed a whistleblower complaint, not with the SEC, but with the IRS, laying out those allegations in detail, backed by internal documents. 3 weeks later, in December 2019, the Washington Post published the story, built directly on the paperwork the Nielsen brothers had compiled. Here's the detail almost nobody includes when they tell this story. David Nielsen didn't actually want the complaint made public. In a statement afterward, he said the disclosure had been unauthorized by me. He'd wanted the number examined through the proper regulatory channel, not printed across the front of a national newspaper by his own brother. The whistleblower who exposed the largest religious fund in American history didn't even get to control how his own warning was heard. The cost to him was immediate and mostly invisible from the outside. He'd left a faith community that had shaped his entire life over a disagreement about a spreadsheet. He'd turned on an employer that had trusted him with its most closely guarded number. And he did it knowing exactly what that kind of break tends to cost inside a tight-knit religious community. Friendships, standing, in some cases relationships built almost entirely around shared belief. It would have been easier, by every practical measure, to say nothing. Keep the job, keep the ward, keep the number to himself, the way every portfolio manager before him had. But Nielsen made the opposite calculation, that a commandment he still believed in was being quietly hollowed out by the very institution that taught it to him, and that believing in something is supposed to mean more than staying comfortable inside it. But he didn't stop in 2019. In February 2023, Nielsen submitted a separate 90-page memorandum directly to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, laying out additional allegations far more serious than the original tax complaint. Systematic accounting misstatements, private inurement, meaning church insiders personally benefiting from tax-exempt funds, and what the document called a Klein conspiracy, a specific federal charge for conspiring to defraud the government through deceit. Later that same year, he went on national television and said publicly, on camera, what he'd spent 4 years trying to say through proper channels alone. The church's public response, throughout, was measured. It never denied the fund's existence, or broadly its scale. It said the reserves existed to protect the church against economic uncertainty, the same argument any endowment manager on earth would make, and that it strongly disagreed with the characterization that money was simply being hoarded. But once the Nielsen complaint went public, nobody could put the number back in the dark. For the first time, a specific figure, somewhere near $100 billion, sat attached in a federal filing to a fund the public had never once been allowed to measure. Regulators were now looking. Not at the tax exemption question the Nielsens had actually raised with the IRS. That question would take years and remains unresolved even now. But at a narrower, separate question that turned out to be much easier to prove. Who had actually filed those 1313Fs, and why? And when SEC investigators started pulling those filings, one by one, they found the shell structure, sitting there, in plain sight, in public records, exactly as it had been built, expanded once in fear, and rebuilt twice. But before we get to the fine, it's worth answering the question this whole film has been circling. In 22 years, did the Storehouse ever actually open its doors? Once. Publicly. Unmistakably. In 2012, on a block directly across the street from Temple Square, the church unveiled City Creek Center, an open-air luxury mall with a retractable glass roof, a Tiffany's, a Dick's Sporting Goods, an Apple store, and a footbridge connecting it straight to church headquarters. The total cost, by most public estimates, roughly $1.5 billion. Between 2010 and 2014, Ensign Peak Advisors moved $1.4 billion of it to a church-owned real estate arm called Property Reserve Inc. to build it. You'd expect the Storehouse's one public act to look like relief, food, shelter, tuition. But it looked like a Tiffany's, a mall. Not a hospital, not a university, not a relief fund, a mall with a sky bridge to the temple. The church's position, stated publicly and repeated since, is specific and important. No current tithing funds paid for City Creek Center. The money, they say, came from investment earnings and reserves. The returns Ensign Peak had generated over decades, not this year's donations. But the Nielsen brothers disputed that distinction outright, arguing that reserves built entirely from decades of accumulated tithing are, in every practical sense, still tithing money, however many investment cycles it passed through on the way to a shopping mall. Both things can be true at once, and that's exactly the point. A distinction that technical is only possible because nobody outside Ensign Peak could see the ledger well enough to argue about it with real numbers. For 22 years, the fund was invisible enough that even its one visible expenditure came wrapped in a legal argument about what counts as tithing versus what counts as earnings on tithing. You might assume a mall, however debated, was at least the biggest thing the fund ever built. It wasn't. And the mall wasn't even the strangest place the money went. Through a separate church-owned company called Ag Reserves, the same broader financial empire quietly became the single largest private owner of farmland in the United States, an estimated 1.7 million acres worth roughly $16 billion, including nearly 300,000 acres of Florida cattle country and citrus groves that have belonged to the church since 1950. Cow pastures in Florida, a luxury mall in Utah, big tech stock held through a shell company in Delaware. All of it, technically, the same storehouse Malachi described 25 centuries ago. Grain in, but almost nothing visible ever came back out. On February 21, 2023, the SEC announced its findings. Ensign Peak Advisors and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had used those 13 shell companies for 22 years specifically to avoid disclosing the size and true ownership of the portfolio. Both organizations agreed to settle. Neither admitted nor denied the findings, standard language in almost every SEC settlement of this kind. And here is the number the entire 22-year structure came down to. A $4 million penalty against Ensign Peak Advisors. A $1 million penalty against the church itself. $5 million total. Read that last part slowly. Against a fund whose disclosed public filings alone had been worth $32 billion during the very period the SEC investigated. Run that math, and it comes out to this. For every $6,400 the disclosed portfolio held, the penalty was $1. That's before you even account for the far larger, undisclosed total the whistleblower had placed closer to $100 billion. Against that number, the fine doesn't even register as a rounding error. No individual was named. No one on the first presidency, no one at Ensign Peak, was personally fined, charged, or barred from the industry. The 13 shell companies were dissolved. The church issued a statement saying it was pleased to resolve the matter and had already taken steps to ensure future compliance. It sounded almost like an apology. But it wasn't one, because an apology admits the harm, and this settlement, by its own careful legal language, admitted nothing at all. That's the entire price of hiding the largest religious fund in American history from federal regulators for 2 decades. A fine smaller than many single stock trades the fund executes in a single afternoon, and a promise to file the paperwork correctly from now on. But the fund itself didn't shrink. It kept growing. By 2024, its disclosed 13 F holdings alone, filed now under Ensign Peak's own name in full compliance, had crossed $50 billion. Then, by that November, nearly $57 billion. And that's still only the portion the law requires to be made public. Ensign Peak's own reported total assets under management, by the mid-2020s, run past $120 billion. Meanwhile, the broader question Nielsen cared about most, whether a tax-exempt organization can legally accumulate that much wealth without spending a defined share of it, was never resolved by the SEC case at all. That case was only ever about the paperwork. The Senate Finance Committee memo, the private inurement allegations, the underlying tax question, as of this filming, still sit unresolved in a drawer somewhere in Washington. Which means the fine settled the crime of hiding the number. It never touched the number itself. And before you file this away as a uniquely Mormon story, sit with one more fact. Nothing about the underlying structure was actually unique to a church. A donor-advised fund, the increasingly popular vehicle wealthy Americans now use for their own charitable giving, can legally hold your donation for years, even decades, without ever distributing it, while you still claim the tax deduction the day you handed the money over. A 501c4 nonprofit can spend heavily on political influence without disclosing a single donor's name. The commandment here was tithing. Out there, in your own tax return, it might just be a receipt from a fund you've never once been shown the balance of. Remember that revelation from 1838, the one that made tithing a standing law forever? It never said the money had to be spent within a year, or even within a lifetime. That Storehouse language, meet in mine house, was Malachi's promise, not a legal requirement. And that gap between a sacred principle and an enforceable obligation is exactly where a fund can grow from single-digit billions to over $120 billion, build one glass-roofed mall as proof of life, and still never technically break the commandment that built it. The rule wasn't broken. It was outgrown. Quietly, one filing at a time, twice redesigned under pressure, until the storehouse and the vault became almost impossible to tell apart. Here's the honest case for the defense one more time, stated plainly and not as a punchline. Reserves protect institutions during downturns. No law required Ensign Peak to spend faster than it did. And plenty of secular endowments hold on to wealth for generations without anyone calling it a betrayal. Was Ensign Peak fulfilling its founding promise, protecting a faith's future the way any prudent endowment protects an institution? Or was it exactly what its own whistleblower called it, money that stopped serving the people who gave it? I've shown you what the documents say, and I've shown you the strongest version of both answers. What they mean is genuinely, I think, for you to decide. But here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't unique to one church, one fund, or 13 shell companies in Salt Lake City. Almost every faith that has ever touched real money has, at some point, run straight into the same wall. A sacred rule that says give, colliding with a very human instinct to keep. Some faiths solve that collision the way this one did, a storehouse quietly outgrowing itself behind paperwork. Others ban an entire financial mechanism outright, by name, in Scripture, and then spend 14 centuries building a global industry that does exactly what was forbidden, under a different word. Next time, a faith with 1.9 billion followers, a financial practice named explicitly as sin in its holy text, and a $4 trillion industry that found a way to do it anyway and simply call it something else. If you're the kind of person who wants to see how power hides inside paperwork, not the version in the press release, but the version in the filing, that's exactly what this channel is for.